Welcome back to creating and applying textures to illustrations in Adobe Photoshop. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at creating two grass brushes. Here's an example of some grass, and rather than drawing in every blade of grass, we're going to make life easy by creating two brushes. Here are the brushes we will be creating, and here are my basic brush settings we will be using to draw these brushes. The settings for my standard Photoshop brush are: brush tip hardness is at 100%, with shape dynamics at 1% spacing. In shape dynamics, size jitter is at 0%, control is at pen pressure, minimum diameter to 70%, and in transfer, all settings are at 0%. Let's begin by creating a large rough grass shape using the hard brush. The brush shortcut is B on your keyboard. Next, to make the strokes more pointed, we carve into the shape by using the eraser, which is E on your keyboard. Reference the grass texture photo and add in lots of bent triangles. We don't want this to look too uniform. It's okay to go back and forth until you feel you have an interesting silhouette. Next, we lasso selections, L on the keyboard, and move them around using the direct selection tool, which is V on the keyboard. We then scale the selections by pressing Ctrl or Command T on your keyboard to bring up the transform tool. We can also copy selections by pressing Ctrl or Command C, then pasting selections by pressing Ctrl or Command V. We can do this to quickly create a grass silhouette. These selections can also be transformed and mirrored using the transform tool, Ctrl or Command T, to give us new elements. We carry on this way until we get a pleasing grass silhouette. Then go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, name and save the brush as 3.2 Grass Brush A. Changing the brush dynamics. Test out the brush to see how it looks with no settings changed. Then change brush properties by pressing F5 to open the brush preset, or go to Window, Brush. Draw out a stroke to see how the brush works. In these settings, we're going to look at the brush tip shape. Spacing to 67%, then test out the stroke again. In shape dynamics, size jitter is set to 72% and control to pen pressure. This is to give us some variety in the size of the brush head in the stroke. Now, let's test out the brush stroke. Angle jitter is set to 4%. Then test the brush again. Next we move on to scatter, where scatter is set to 48% on both axes, with the control set to pen pressure. Continue to test out the brush to see what tweaking the settings does to the stroke. The count is set to 4, and the count jitter to 21%. Then test the brush. This will give us a random feel to the brush tip placement, while still maintaining some control of where the grass appears. Here we play with the transfer settings, which will change the opacity of the stroke. This can be great for semi-transparent elements, like when painting clouds or water. However, in this case, it's not appropriate, so we uncheck transfer. Then we go back into scattering to tweak the settings, where we increase the scatter to 143% to make the scattering even more random. In shape dynamics, we turn on the roundness jitter control to pen pressure, and set the roundness jitter to 24%. Play with the minimum roundness, which I set to 100%. Then take the roundness jitter down again to 19%, as I felt 24% was a little too extreme. Tweaking the angle jitter to 6% and the minimum diameter to 12%, back into scattering, I changed pen pressure to 119%. I then up the count to 5 and the count jitter to 31%. Then we test the brush again. I like how this brush is working, so let's save the brush. You do this by clicking on the square at the bottom of the dialog box with the folded corner. Call the brush 3.2 Grass Brush A. Draw out grass shape 2. Draw out some random long thin lines. Here we're trying to recreate a more straw-like grass to add variety to the grass texture. We carve into these lines with the eraser and draw out some thin blades, moving them with the lasso tool, L on the keyboard, and the direct selection tool, V on the keyboard, to give a pleasing composition. Use Ctrl or Command T to transform the selection. Next we draw in some seed heads and a couple of the stalks. And then we go to Edit, Define Brush Preset and name the brush 3.2 Grass Brush B. To change the brush dynamics, we press F5 again, or go to Window, Brush if the dialog box isn't already open. We then change the following settings. The brush tip shape, the spacing to 91%, shape dynamics, size jitter to 78%, minimum diameter 43%, angle jitter to 4%. Then we test the stroke. Next we move on to scattering, where we change the scatter to 190% on both axes, and then count to 1. Then we test the brush again. Let's test out the brush again. The angle looks a little strange, so I change the angle jitter back to 0% and count is increased to 2. Continuing to play with the scatter settings, we change it up to 262%, then test. The scatter is a bit too much, so we reduce the scattering to 100%, count to 1 and test again. This brush is looking good, so I save the brush by clicking the square at the bottom of the dialog box with a folded corner and call the brush 3.2 Grass Brush B1. Next time on creating and applying textures to illustrations in Adobe Photoshop, we will be looking at using our grass brushes to create a grass texture. Thanks for listening.